Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about school funding. The phone lines in the Harrisburg region are down, but you can text us at 717-219-4001 to join the discussion. Today we're joined by Representative Mike Sturla, a Democrat representing Lancaster, and Senator Kristin Phillips-Hill, a Republican representing York. Both serve as co-chairs of the Basic Education Funding Commission. Thank you both for joining us today. Senator, we'll start with you. The Basic Education Funding Commission was charged with looking at the school funding formula. Can you talk a little bit about what your goals are and the series of hearings that you've been holding since September?
Absolutely. So the Basic Education Funding Commission was initially created to review that funding formula. There had been a lot of controversy about that funding formula over many years. As a result, I think primarily of the hold harmless provision in the state's education funding formula. Initially created 2014, issued the first report in 2015, statutorily required to meet every 5 years. And we know that in 2020, we were in the midst of COVID pandemic. Things got a little delayed. So we were reconstituted by the current governor to meet and assess, is that funding formula meeting the goals and objectives that we have to assure that we are providing a thorough and efficient education to every child in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so we have taken the show on the road, so to speak. We have traversed our entire Commonwealth, had a 10th hearing just last week in Bedford, and are looking forward to having our final hearing in Harrisburg this week. And we have taken testimony from just about every possible stakeholder. And we're looking to finish things up and then get to work on writing a report with our recommendations.
Representative Sturla, from your perspective, how has this last funding formula, the one that the report came out in 2015 and was initiated in 2016, how has that been working so far?
Well, it's doing a little bit of what it was supposed to do. And I was on that initial commission back in 2015. And at the time, we said, look, the formula that we had been using, or the lack of formula that we had been using up to that point, was considered the worst in the nation. We were, if you've included the District of Columbia, we were 51st. We were dead last. And we said, okay, we got to dig ourselves out of this hole. And we took the sort of tact of saying, let's do this in a slow, methodical way, because we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of this overnight. Fast forward 8 years, we're charged with trying to figure out where we're at. We're only about 30% of the way there 8 years later. And the courts have since come down with a decision after a 9-year lawsuit that said, yeah, I'm sorry, guys, what you're doing is still not constitutional. And so that has also fallen on our laps in terms of how do we make this funding formula and basic education funding overall constitutional, so that it doesn't end up back in the courts and having the courts make this decision for us. Because I think the first thing we were in agreement on was the best thing we can do is make sure the courts aren't the ones deciding this, that the legislature actually is doing what we're supposed to. So,
as you were developing these hearings and planning everything, how did you decide who to involve, who to hear testimony from, and where to hold the hearings?
Well, I think that we work together in a bipartisan fashion. We have members from each chamber, each party, as well as from the administration, the Department of Education, the governor's budget office. And we wanted to be respectful of our members. We took our hearings to their districts, and we empowered members to write the agenda and collaboratively put forward requests for individuals to testify. And I think it's been robust. We have received a tremendous amount of testimony. If anyone out there is watching and wants to share their thoughts, their perspective, or information with us, we have a website. It's basiceducationfundingcommission.com. You can go on, you can share information with us, and it can become part of the public record. And I think it's really important that everyone is heard. And when we kicked off that first hearing, I said, we're going to hear things that we like, and we're going to hear things that we don't like. We're going to hear things that we agree with, and we're going to hear things that we don't agree with. But what we really need to do is to listen. And then, this is the tough part. Once these hearings are completed, we have to sit down. It's like finishing a college course and having to write that term paper. So we've got a big term paper, and that will be the report that the commission puts forward to the General Assembly, making those recommendations.
What were some of the most common concerns that you heard from the various testifiers throughout these series of hearings?
Well, it was really varied, and part of it, I think, we made sure that, look, anybody that testified at the court hearings, we tried to make sure we understood what they were saying, so that we knew why the courts were saying that the current way of doing things was unconstitutional. But the court then also, in their ruling, it was 786-page ruling, went beyond the funding formula itself and talked about things like public libraries and early childhood education, things that are outside the purview of that formula right now. And so we've heard from those people also to say, okay, if the courts felt that this was critical to getting to a constitutional way of funding education, let's hear from you all. And so we've heard things about, tax relief. We've heard things about more equitable funding. We've heard about adequacy. We've heard about timeliness in terms of not having this take 25 to 50 years to accomplish, but taking 5 years to accomplish. And those are I've always said that the task before us is really daunting, but from my perspective, very welcome in that I think we have an opportunity to get it right.
The latest funding formula, the one that was issued in roughly 2016 or 2017, that one builds on the current funding formula that existed prior to that. Is there an anticipation that everything may get scrapped and start from scratch, or is this intended to be another layer of a funding formula on top of the last two?
Well, I think that's something that is being discussed. One of the testimonies that really sticks out to me, in my mind, is from the Pennsylvania Association of School Budget Officers, the numbers people for our school districts. And they talked about the need for predictability and stability in the funding that they receive. And the new formula has done a lot of things well, but one of the challenges with that new formula is that you can lose one or two students in a specific population, whether it's poverty, concentrated poverty, and all of a sudden you face this daunting fiscal cliff where you lose two students, but then you lose a massive amount of funding. And that's really difficult for school districts to be nimble and to adjust to in terms of how they are funding the programs that they have. Two kids doesn't mean that you eliminate an entire classroom or an entire program. So I think that's one of the things that we're looking to figure out, how we provide that predictability and stability in funding for our school districts. I think one of the other things that has been pretty striking is concerns and challenges with our school facilities. But from my mind, we don't even have an assessment of what our facilities are, what the facility needs are. And I think back to when I became a school board director back in 2011, found myself in a similar position. And we were fortunate we had a school board director on our board who was in engineering and in the facility space. And so we literally used that talent that we had to go through the district and do an assessment of all our facilities. And the interesting thing with that was we saved a lot of money as a result of that. We changed the way we heated some of our buildings, we changed the way we lighted some of our buildings, and we found an incredible amount of savings for the district. So I think that's an area where we might be able to assist school districts in wrapping their arms around what their facility challenges are and perhaps even finding ways for them to save money.
Since you brought up the issue of infrastructure, I know there's been a lot of talk, particularly regarding some of the city schools that don't have heat, they don't have air conditioning, they need remediation for asbestos and so forth. Is that something that may get addressed in the school code that is still before the legislature this year? Or is that something that you think is a broader issue that may need to go into this funding formula as well?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to look at this. One, there are some immediate concerns, what I call sort of immediate health and safety concerns. If you've got buildings that have mold in them, if you've got buildings where kids can't attend on hot days, and there's lead or asbestos, those are things, or ones that don't have at least the first level of hardening for school entrance to make sure that there's not an active shooter. We can and we have some dollars in the rainy day fund. We have some dollars in surplus for our budgets. Those can be used immediately to address some of those, what I call emergency concerns. The long-term portion that the senator was talking about earlier, that I think there does need to be a statewide assessment of all buildings in the state of Pennsylvania and say, okay, where are we and how do we get there? And that really is over a 30 plus year period because we know that school buildings, brand new ones, about 30 to 35 years from now, need to be renovated and updated and new technology and things like that. But we don't need to make every building, spot on tomorrow. But we do need to take care of those immediate concerns. But I want to get back to the funding formula a little bit because you mentioned how do we plan to move forward on that. I think that if you look at the funding formula itself, about 70% right now is in what's called the static portion or the base formula. And the other 30% is in a very dynamic formula. That base formula originally was, we locked in the old worst formula ever. We've since added level up money into that. And so it's not the 51st anymore, it might be the 35th. But if we can make that base equitable, and lock in that as 70 or 80 or 90% of funding that goes to schools, we can make them have a consistent, understandable idea of what they're going to get. And then that dynamic portion will flow based on, hey, you got 500 new kids dropped in your school district, you're going to get some more money this year. Hey, something else happened, you're going to have, these things taken care of in that dynamic portion of the formula. And I think there's a way we can get to that. I really do. I think that is we can continue to build on that base and make sure that no one is left holding the bag like, oh, this year your funding got cut. I don't think we need to cut funding for anybody. Even the schools that everybody says are overfunded, technically, by other state standards, are not overfunded. We're still not funding 50% of the cost of education in the state of Pennsylvania. And until we do, I don't think anybody can start talking about which school districts are overfunded or underfunded.
How does Pennsylvania's school funding compare with that in other states?
Well, when you look at Pennsylvania's school funding overall, we rank very high across the nation. I think the challenge that we have is how that funding is put forward. And, we talk a lot about how we're going to do that. I think it's interesting to note that in that court case that came down, that the judge didn't just talk about how much funding, but how that funding is collected and how that funding is distributed. And what we find is that there are some school districts that are very heavily reliant on state funding, and there's some school districts that are very heavily reliant on the local school property tax revenue that they have from homeowners. So that is part of this challenge of how we assure that we do this equitably and how we make sure that it's distributed in a way that's fair and makes sense.
Yeah. And if I could just follow up, the senator pointed out about the court saying, how are you spending that money in terms of, and what programs are you using? If we actually have examples here in Pennsylvania, looking back, 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, up to when we made a cut to education, we actually were considered one of the best states in the nation in terms of advances that we had made. We were still behind a lot of states, but we had more achievement gaps filled with students than we had ever done before. We were leading the country in terms of the most advancement in standardized tests because we had some programs that specifically said, you can get more money, but you have to use this program that's been proven to get better achievement. You can't teach reading in a way that doesn't get kids to learn how to read. You got to teach them in a way that they can learn. You got to teach math in a way that kids actually learn math, as opposed to just saying, well, I gave them a textbook and here we are, and so we actually have examples in our own state of how to do this. So again, I think the tools are there for us. It's a matter of us putting it together and making sure that it works.
I think that that accountability is an important concept that I think we have broad bipartisan support on. But I want to go back to one of the things that the representative shared, and that is this conversation about cuts. In 2008, the federal government provided us with one-time revenues. And when I got to the school board in 2011, I had a letter from the former budget secretary that said, these are one-time federal dollars. Do not use these for recurring expenses. But many school districts use them for recurring expenses. And so they talked about the cuts. There wasn't a cut. The feds just didn't continue to provide that level of funding to the states for education. Flash forward, here we are in a global pandemic, and the federal government sends the states considerable amounts of money. We sent a lot of that money to our school districts with a letter that said, do not use these for recurring expenses. These are one-time federal dollars. I can tell you back home in my district, I sent every school board director and every superintendent a letter that reiterated that point, because lesson learned from that 2008-2010 timeframe is that when federal one-time dollars are used for recurring expenses, schools find themselves in a bad way. And we have subsequently taken testimony from school districts where superintendents have said publicly, yes, we've used one-time revenues for recurring expenses. And I think we need to assure fiscal responsibility, because that puts us in a really bad position moving forward. And once you give something to someone, it's really hard to take it back. When you're providing programs and then all of a sudden you say, well, we used one-time federal dollars for those and we can't provide it anymore, people aren't really happy. So it's better not to put yourself into that position. We want to assure that. The other point about accountability, again, broad bipartisan support. People work really hard to pay their tax dollars to the Commonwealth. Educating our students for their future success, that's the future success of our entire Commonwealth. So we don't want to see taxpayer dollars invested in things that aren't going to yield the needed results, which is children who can read and write and be ready for the workforce or ready for higher education or ready to join the armed forces. So I think we need to assure accountability for those dollars and ultimately for those students.
Representative, since you initially brought up the issue of accountability, what kind of accountability benchmarks do you foresee perhaps being included? Things like standardized testing, graduation rates. What do you think may be included there?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of those. And look, we can also look at, we have 500 little laboratories out there called school districts in the state of Pennsylvania, and there are school districts that are getting good test scores, that kids at third grade are reading at third grade level. And kids that are doing math in seventh grade are doing it at seventh grade level. We know that if kids can read at third grade level in third grade and do math at seventh or eighth grade level in seventh or eighth grade, that in one sense, they can have a bad year at school and they're still going to be a lifelong learner because they have the tools necessary to get them through in spite of a bad teacher or a bad experience at school or something else going on. So when you look at the schools that say, okay, who does the best at that, and what are they spending, and how are they testing, and what are their graduation rates, and there's a whole matrix you can put together. we can then say those are our model schools. And if we can then say every school should figure out how to be that model school, and how do we fund? We know that there are kids that have a harder time getting to those points, so we need to spend a little more money on those. We know that there are different tax structures in local communities, and we know that in some cases it's easy to raise money locally, in other cases it's really hard. I mean, I always call this a large calculus problem that's fed by a lot of other smaller calculus problems. And as somebody who likes math and loves to go over, spreadsheets and things like that, I mean, I'll sit in a room for 3 days and just crunch numbers. You can get there. You actually can get there. And it's not easy. It's not just, there's not one simple answer. It is 100 complex answers that lead to a good outcome. And our job is to sort of cover every one of those complex issues and figure out how best to get us to where we need to be.
Senator, a few moments ago, you voiced concerns about if a school loses a few students, they could lose a good chunk of funding. Could you talk a little bit about what the hold harmless provision is, and if there's any potential for that to not continue into the future?
So those are actually two separate things. Mm-hmm. So the hold harmless provision was put into the school funding formula in 1991. And so what that essentially did was say that a school district would never receive less funding than they did in that year. So as school districts grew and other school districts shrunk, the school districts that were shrinking were getting more per pupil than the school districts that were growing. This has been a huge issue in York County, where I serve, and they really struggled to figure out a way to address that formula. And that's why that commission on basic education funding finally came to pass, because there was no easy solution. And that's typically the path that the General Assembly takes when something is really difficult and intractable. They'll create a commission, they'll take a lot of testimony, they'll put all those minds at the table to try and come up with a solution. That solution was this new dynamic formula. And in probably what is one of the greatest examples of compromise, they made a decision to keep that existing funding formula for the base, and then all new dollars that would go into public education would flow through that new formula. Now, I will tell you that when Governor Wolf finished his second and final term as governor, he left Harrisburg touting one of the accomplishments of his administration was the huge amount of money that was put into public education. Governor Shapiro, after his first budget, which we're still working to complete, touted the fact that we put a lot of money into education funding. So we're going to go back and we're going to look at that. If this was an easy problem to fix, I can assure you that this would have been fixed decades ago. But there have been winners and there have been losers. And, we sit at this table. There are 50 state senators. There are 203 state House members. And each of them are impacted differently by this problem. And so we're trying to assure that whatever we do it in a way that doesn't impair students. And so when we talked about losing two people, so this new formula is really dynamic. I think that's what they intended for it to be student-driven. But we know that there are multiple factors. How many students you have as English is their second language? How many students are in poverty? How many students are in concentrated poverty? How many students are in sparsity? We know that educating students in very rural areas brings a whole set of challenges. So when we talk about the concentrated poverty factor, there's a certain number of students that means you have a concentrated poverty you get funding for that. If you lose 2 students, you can fall out of what's considered concentrated poverty. Well, we know that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get rid of the programs to address those issues, that you are going to remove a classroom, you're going to be able to not have as many educators. And so you lose a huge chunk of money, and you find this out very late in the game. And so school districts are more like a school bus than they are a sports car. And it's very hard for them to maneuver really quickly to address those issues. So we need to figure out a way to smooth that formula so that when you lose a few students, you don't face that huge fiscal cliff that really puts your district into a financial tailspin.
Representative, you've previously advocated for including student trauma as a factor in school funding as well. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. Well, look, there's been longitudinal studies that have been done for decades now that look at adverse childhood experiences. They're called ACEs, and there's 10 ACEs, and there are actually more as things have moved forward, because they've now started to look at kids that live in extreme poverty, or kids that live in areas where there's a lot of gun violence and things like that. But basically, if you have a kid who has a parent that's in prison, a parent that has drug and alcohol addiction, that has been sexually abused, that has various other factors, those are adverse childhood experiences. And we know from studies that have been done for decades now that if a child has more than 3 adverse childhood experiences, they are more likely to drop out of school, they're more likely to have drug and alcohol addiction, they're more likely to have marriages that end in divorce, they're more likely to have heart disease and diabetes. I mean, it's just factually true. And so what we want to do is, what we also know is that kids are very resilient. And so you always hear the success stories about, well, I know that person, they grew up in a really terrible home and they were poor, and look at them, they're a multimillionaire now, they've made it. When you talk to those people, they always talk about a coach or an aunt or someone in their life, a minister, somebody who sort of took them as a special project and said, I'm going to look out for you. And I always make it akin to, we know that PTSD with soldiers is a real thing. If at the front line every time there was a back door where the guy could say, you know what, things are getting a little too tough, I'm walking out the back door, and you're suddenly off the front line, you probably wouldn't end up with PTSD. These kids never get that back door to walk out unless there's somebody in their lives who presents that for them. So what we're trying to do is make sure that those kids get identified in the school system, and that there's somebody who says, okay, let me figure out what's going on here. We've seen that there's a school up in the Lehigh Valley that has done trauma-informed training for all of their personnel, everybody from the lunch lady and the janitor to the principal and the teachers and everybody in between. They went from more than 1,500 referrals to the principal's office in a year to less than 300. Because people said when the kid was acting out, what's going on today? And what they found out was, well, my dad got arrested last night, or my mom and dad had a fight last night and I ended up sleeping in the closet. Or, when you find out those things, that kid's reaction is a normal reaction, not something that deserves a trip to the principal's office where they get labeled as a troublemaker. And we start them down that path of every time somebody does something to you, you get punished even more. And so by doing that, we can basically encourage those kids to use the schools as this safe haven and a place to learn. And it increases test scores, it does all sorts of things. So how do we put that into a funding formula? I'm not sure that we necessarily put it into a funding formula, but I think we can say, I want to make sure that every school has the ability to do the trauma training for their teachers and their faculty and everybody in the school. And then they will continue to train the trainers, and we can get somewhere by simply giving them the tools necessary to do this and let them move forward with the process.
We're going to continue our discussion on school funding in just a moment, but first I'd like to give our guests a break, and let's look at some upcoming programming on PCN. Join us for a live stream of a gun violence prevention rally today at 11 a.m., streaming free on cable and on PCN Select. Join us for a double dose of On the Issues this week as we discuss the Clean Slate Law with Representative Cheryl DeLozier, followed by Dog Law with Senator Elder Vogel. That's Wednesday night starting at 6. This week's Journalist Roundtable will look back at the general election results and what those results may mean as we head into the 2024 elections. We'll also consider various issues before the General Assembly. This week's guests include Kim Lyons, editor at the Pennsylvania Capitol Star, Julia Taruso, reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Anthony Hennon, staff reporter at the Center Square. Journalist Roundtable airs Thursday night at 6. All the great public affairs event coverage and interviews you watch at PCN are now available for free online at pcntv.com and on PCN Select. Thank you for watching PCN. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We're relying on viewers and donors like you to help PCN to continue to bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit pcntv.com. Let's get back into our discussion now on school funding. We're joined by the chairs of the Basic Education Funding Commission, Representative Mike Sturla, Senator Kristin Phillips-Hill. Senator, one of the testifiers that particularly made news was a gentleman from Penn State who he put a price tag on school funding at $6.2 billion. How do you quantify how much money the basic education in general needs?
So it was very interesting. Dr. Kelly was paid by the plaintiffs to crunch those numbers. And it was interesting to note that when he testified before the courts, that number was $4.6 billion. By the time he testified before us, it was $6.2 billion. And certainly, I think the people who really understand the numbers for our school districts are the Pennsylvania Association of School Budget Officers, those folks that crunch those numbers for the 500 school districts across the Commonwealth. So I think that was really important. And actually, the hearing that was held in my district in Hanover, York County, we brought in the school budget officers to speak about what do those numbers really look like and what are those needs. And it's interesting, other testifiers have indicated there's been a lot of analogies. We've talked a lot about buckets. We've talked a lot about plumbing and how those pipes carry that funding to our school districts. And one of the testifiers used the analogy of that plumbing system with your pipes and the water, and that money is like water. The current pipes just could never handle that much money. And so those are some of the things that we're working through and trying to assess. But I think it's important to remember that this commission is not tasked with identifying how much money needs to go into funding education from the state level. This commission is tasked with assessing how the formula for the distribution of that state aid is constructed. And that's what we are going to be tasked with crafting and recommending to the General Assembly. This commission, we do not have the ability to act unilaterally on our own. Everything we recommend are recommendations for action by the General Assembly. And then we expect that there will be some sort of legislation crafted, and it will need the signature of the governor to become law.
Yeah. So I think, Dr. Kelly's testimony, which he gave to the courts, which they found credible, and they didn't find other people's testimony credible, was set at $4.5 billion, something like that, when he testified before the courts. When he came and talked to us, he also included special ed in that, because he was advocating for bringing special ed in under the basic ed formula. It's currently a separate line item. That adds $1 billion. So right there, you're up to $5.5 billion. So I think the disparity in dollars was based on what he was including in one set of testimony versus what he was including in another set of testimony. But the basis of that was equity and adequacy. And so what they did was they looked at schools, as I pointed out earlier, that have been successful in the state of Pennsylvania and how much they're spending per student and what the outcomes are. And so they've said, okay, if that's what it takes to get an outcome, then that would be considered an adequate amount of money. And in order to get us to adequacy, based on the number of students we have and the weighted factors that we put on them, you'd need another $5 to $6 billion. Now, in none of that was there included the whole issue of facilities. And if you look at, we have 3,900 some odd school facilities in the state of Pennsylvania that need to get either replaced or repaired every 33 years, probably replaced every 100 years or so. You're looking at another couple of $1 billion a year. So I think, and as was pointed out, it's not our charge to figure out where all the money's coming from. But I think that people need to sort of grasp the notion that the state is not putting in their fair share at this point in time. And, we've got to figure out how we get to that point. Because while we are high in funding, when you look at us compared to other states, it's because we have some local school districts that are putting a boatload of money into the system. And so they're spending $30,000+ a year per student, which makes us on average look high, when in fact there are others that are spending way less than what would be considered adequate. And unless we can fill up that adequacy bucket, and I've often said there's a difference between equity and equality. Not everybody's going to get to that $30,000 level, because not everybody needs to get to that $30,000 level. We know that we need to get to a $14,000 level. And if everybody can, in essence, see over the fence at the $14,000 level, that means I've got an art program, I've got a school librarian, I've got, I have access to tutoring, things like that. That doesn't mean that I need to, the example I've used is, it doesn't mean my art class needs to travel to Europe to see the Mona Lisa in the Louvre every year. If you're spending $30,000 and you want to send your kids someplace like that, go ahead and knock yourselves out. That's not what we're going to fund. But we do need to fund the fact that that kid at least needs access to an art class or a music class, or has to have a few sports available to them, and those kinds of things. And we've seen those be cut in school districts that lack this funding that's necessary from the state.
While we consider perhaps addressing disparities by funneling more money through the state as opposed to local government, Senator, can you talk a little bit about some of the concerns that arise if we make a shift to greater state control versus local control?
Well, we actually heard testimony to that right here in Cumberland County. And there's also the taxpayer equity issue. I represent a county that has many people who pay very hefty local school property tax bills. And we're not funding a $30,000 per pupil a year system of education in Southern York County. So what does that look like when they pay really high local property tax bills to fund the education of their own students, and also pay a significant amount of taxes to the Commonwealth? And what's that equity there? That's also something that I think many of us believe need to be factored into this equation.
There have been various legislative proposals over the years to try to eliminate the property tax. Why has that been such a difficult thing to do?
Well, to start with, there's no state that's ever done it. Michigan tried it. They eliminated the local property taxes, and within 6 months came back and instituted a state property tax that equaled what the local property taxes were. So it was just taking it away from local control and putting it in state control. So look, it is a stable funding source. And no matter what happens with the economy, it takes a while for the property taxes to change. And so it means that there's some consistency and predictability in school funding. If you take that away and you run into a recession and suddenly your school's going to lay off, 20 or 30 teachers because the economy is down, your kids are going to suffer dramatically. And so what we've tried to do is make sure that that doesn't happen. But as my school district, when we had a meeting in my district, pointed out, they've raised local taxes every year, and they are woefully underfunded, about $20 million a year. And I said to them, what would happen if we actually got to the point over the next 5 years where you were getting the funds that by rights, I believe you deserve based on a fair funding formula? And they said, we wouldn't raise taxes. And so in some cases, it's not even a tax cut. It's just to stop the bleeding. Because right now, every year, we know we're going to have to go donate blood again at the local tax level. And part of that is just daunting when you say, why would I move somewhere where I know my taxes are going to go up every year? At least give me a break. Maybe once every 5 years there's a minor change, that kind of thing. But don't do this every year. And the poor districts can't get away with doing anything less.
The challenge with that response is that essentially the gentleman from Lancaster is arguing for every other taxpayer in the Commonwealth to pay more to fund his school district, which, by the way, 35% of most third-class cities' school systems don't pay any property taxes at all because they have government buildings, they have other nonprofit buildings, and that's the very part of the challenge that we face in how we fund this system of public education. Essentially, what he's arguing for is figuring out a more equitable way to fund public education. And remember that the judge said it's not necessarily the amount of money, it's how we collect that money, how we distribute that money. Their challenge right now is that when you've got 35% of your real estate paying no school property taxes, you've got to look to other sources for funding. Otherwise, it's a really over-encumbered school property taxpayer in your district, or you're looking at other people around the state to fund your children's education.
Yeah, and by and large, those tax-exempt properties that are concentrated in small cities, like usually the county seat, serve the entire county. But it's the taxpayers within a very small area that suffer the burden of that. And what I've also said is, look, whenever I get a chance to talk to the Chamber of Commerce, I say, how many businesses, I have a room of 300 business people, and I say, how many businesses here only hire people from the school district where your business is located? And they all kind of look at me like I've just got, I'm a Martian or something, And they say, no, it's like a 50 or 60 mile radius that is where our workforce comes from. And then I always say, then you should be as concerned about whether those schools are adequately funded as you are about whether the school where your kids go to is adequately funded, because that's your future workforce. This is not look, I'm all for local control, but at the same time, there's a broader perspective here in terms of the state of Pennsylvania and educating all children. Just educating kids in my own school district. If my business only operated in my own school district, if I'm insular and I build, walls around the edge of my school district, hey, go ahead, knock yourselves out. That's not how the world operates. And so I think we have to be cognizant of that also in terms of understanding that tell you what, I'll send all my kids over to your school district. How about that one? Oh, no, you can't do that. Well, then, okay, help me fund my kids in my district, So.
Another aspect of school funding needs includes technological advances. Senator, as chair of the Senate Communications and Technology Committee, you're heavily involved in helping to distribute technology, internet access. Can you talk a little bit about that and what kind of inroads that has made and where those needs still lie?
Absolutely. So I previously chaired the Senate Communications and Technology Committee. The good lady from Montgomery County, Senator Penny Cook, is currently the chair. I'm now the vice chair. But I am our caucus's designee to the Broadband Development Authority. My interest in connectivity began years ago as a newly minted House member representing a very rural district where students couldn't use Turnitin.com for their papers. Students couldn't practice their math facts on Study Island because they lacked the connectivity at home. And you would literally see people parked in the school parking lot, moms with a cup of coffee, laptops glowing in the back with the kids doing their work. And this was really an issue. And just began to work to build awareness of the issue. And for legislators who lived in more urban areas, they would look at you like, what are you talking about? I think subsequently with the global pandemic, when everybody had to make a really quick shift to their children being educated at home, they and their spouses working from home, seeking medical care from home, people began to realize that there is a real digital divide. And we set about to identify what the barriers were to greater connectivity in Pennsylvania. We did a joint state government commission report. We did a legislative budget and finance commission report. We began to pass meaningful legislation to address barriers, regulatory barriers, some funding barriers. We created a fund to incentivize real connectivity. And with the passage of the Federal Infrastructure Act, the Commonwealth had to stand up the Broadband Development Authority. We had to write a state plan on how we intend to connect people. And we had to map and identify where those pockets are of individuals who lack connectivity. So we looked primarily at the unserved as well as the underserved. Believe it or not, there are even pockets in some of our most urban areas that are underserved. They don't have access to the speeds necessary to do all those things that we need to do online. We have learned that we will be receiving $1.16 billion from the federal government to address this problem. We actually initially set aside some of the federal ARPA dollars. We are in the process of distributing those. Really looking at, when you look at a map of broadband connectivity, there are little holes in that fabric of coverage. Those dollars are going to look through those capital project funds to closing some of those holes in that fabric of connectivity. And then with this additional influx of federal dollars, our hope is to connect as many people as we possibly can. And as well as some of those federal dollars will be for devices and for digital literacy. People who have not been online and don't know how to use those devices or update their security on those devices, those are all things that we need to assure happen. And we recognize that people interact with their government more online. It used to be, back in the day, a lot of people would come to your district office to renew many things through PennDOT. We don't see as much of that anymore because it's really easy. People will hop online and they'll take care of it themselves. Whether you need to renew a license to be a doctor or a nurse or a barber here in Pennsylvania. So it's important that people are able to be connected. And for our children, we talk about the challenges with students having access to resources. In our most sparsely populated school districts, those tiny little districts that are large in mass but small in student population, it's hard for them to provide those additional courses. The internet allows them to connect to other sources of education. We've heard from districts that are collaborating with other districts, and you might be able to access Mandarin Chinese on the internet from another school district. So those kinds of things will bring additional opportunities and I think provide some of that equity that we're looking for students in education.
We only have a few minutes left. I want to address one more concern that had been brought up at some of the hearings. PSCA, the state teacher union, had brought up concerns regarding teacher staffing. Representative, can you talk a little bit about some of the things that are being considered in the legislature to entice teachers or people to get into the profession, and how much of that will be perhaps part of this funding formula versus perhaps peripheral to it?
Yeah, I think we got to do some one-time funding here to get a surge of teachers that are qualified. Part of that is taking people that currently aren't teachers or are in other professions but want to become teachers, and how do we get them certified so that they have some basics in terms of how to educate kids, but can bring the knowledge that they already have from working in another field. I mean, you look particularly in the STEM, the science, technology, and math issues. It would be great to be able to bring some of those people in. Part of the issues that we face, though, is a lot of those people are out in the private sector making a lot more money. And so we're looking at raising teacher salaries. I think they testified that they would like to see a minimum teacher salary of $60,000 a year, which you're talking about somebody who right now in the state of Pennsylvania, in order to become a teacher, you need to maintain a B average all the way through your college career. You have engineers that maintained a C average all their way through college who are making more money than the teacher who maintained a B average all their way through college. And so, we're trying to get qualified people in. The other thing is, and I think, a few years back we said we had more students graduating with education degrees than we had jobs for them in the state of Pennsylvania. And we said we got to make it harder for kids to get an education degree. And we started to slow the number of kids who were graduating with education degrees. What we didn't look at was where those kids were coming from, because we were educating kids from 50 states. And in one sense, I didn't care if we were educating more teachers because we got to pick the cream of the crop here. And the other kids went back home, and so we're now at a point where we don't educate as many teachers as we have slots for, so we got to recruit people from out of state. That's ridiculous in a state like ours where we have great teachers colleges and have a tradition of producing great teachers. So we've got to get ourselves back on track there in terms of the number of kids that we're enticing into education, the number of kids that we're putting through, and the number of people that we're getting to transfer back into an educational career versus something else. And I think we can do that in that 5-year period that we're talking about, trying to get everything ramped up. So, the senator said, look, if we dumped enough money to hire all the teachers that they needed to tomorrow, the school districts couldn't find them to hire. But if we dump it in over a 5-year period, 5 years from now, those teachers will be there and have jobs, and the funding will be there for them. And so I think it's one of those things where we have to work in tandem to make sure it all happens in short order.
We are just about out of time. Senator, one more time, if you can echo, the Basic Education Funding Commission meets one more time this week. What are the next steps?
So we will meet November 16th, Thursday, in the Capitol, and it will be live streamed. Additionally, we are waiting on information from the Independent Fiscal Office. They are doing an assessment of every school district, give us a snapshot of what's going on. I think that'll be important data to help inform the report that we provide to our colleagues in the General Assembly. And we anticipate that we will be wrapping this all up and providing that report in the middle of January.
Senator Kristin Phillips-Hill, Representative Mike Sturla, thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
PCN's Larry Kaspar talked with Senator John DiSanto about a bill that would prohibit candidates from running for more than one office during a single election.
How common is the practice of a candidate running for multiple offices during the same election, Senator?
Well, it's fairly common. In fact, Summerlee and Austin Davis has both done it. And as you know, there's been a number of House of Representative members that have done it this past election cycle, resulting in the House being able to organize themselves and have delayed the business. So I think it's a serious problem.
Well, how do candidates usually justify this practice?
Well, they justify it by saying the voters have the right to vote for whoever they want to, that it can be unconstitutional. But in my opinion, there are constitutional limits on running for office. An example, you have to submit petitions. You have to do a financial disclosure form. And honestly, I believe it presents a false choice to voters if a candidate is running for two different seats, wins one, and whoever voted them for the other seat doesn't get that representation that they voted for.
And your legislation aside, just how do the voters feel about this anyway?
Well, quite strongly, actually. My office was contacted quite a bit saying, why aren't you getting things done? What's the problem? And when I told them what the issues were, that the House members were in fact resigning because they'd run for two different offices, it really infuriated them because they just believe we should be working and getting things done. And, quite frankly, for the last 6 months, we haven't.
And tell us, what is the essence of your legislation? What do you want to do exactly?
Well, the essence of the legislation is it would prevent people from running for 2 public offices at the same time, except for the presidency or vice presidency of the United States. And also, it wouldn't prevent them from being on local or county ballots, which are typically, or political parties, Republican or Democratic Party positions, which are volunteer, done after hours, and don't pay.
Now, go a little deeper for us, Senator. What's the impact on the public of one candidate running for multiple offices? For instance, your release says this practice deprives voters of duly elected representation. So expand on that, please.
Well, it's exactly what I said earlier, and particularly in the House, they could not organize because the difference was so close between the majority and the minority. And in fact, it also requires special elections to be held, which costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to fill these positions, either one of which was going to be empty. So, us not being, and I want to be clear when I say us, the House not being organized. The Senate has been organized and conducting business, sending bills to the House that were not being returned in any fashion until just recently.
How do your colleagues feel about this legislation? I can imagine not everybody would be in favor.
Well, actually, most people are in favor when you discuss it. I only have 5 Republican co-sponsors right now. So I'm assuming that only the Republicans care about good government at this point. But I just don't see how this is not a bipartisan issue and should sail through the process. I like this, in fact, to when I passed my pension forfeiture bill, that we expanded the crimes that state employees would lose their pension for serious crimes, because there was only 15 annotated crimes in that original legislation. Now it's much wider. And I sit here in 2023 go, how can this problem still be happening?
And tell us about, there's something in one of your press releases on this subject. You assert that this practice of a candidate running for multiple offices during the same election, that costs taxpayers money. So expand on that.
Well, exactly. It's what I said earlier. When these offices become vacant through resignation or not being filled, the authorities have to schedule special elections, and that requires all the counties to send out voting machines and ballots and advertising in the newspapers and so on. It's a very lengthy, costly process. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars to run an election, which might be, in fact, for one voting position.
Any indication on how big a priority this could be with your caucus?
I think our caucus is very interested. I have 5 co-sponsors already. I believe when we come back, we'll have more, because the Senate has been very frustrated with the House for the last 6 months, not being able to advance any legislation. Now, they are, in fact, back now, and the process is starting to move. But for 6 or 7 months, we're sitting here as senators. Why are we even here? We're not getting anything done. The process isn't working.
Senator John DiSanto, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Larry. Always a pleasure to see you.
That concludes today's show. Tomorrow on the PCN Capitol Preview, we'll focus on issues related to energy and the environment. We'll be joined by Senator Jean Yaw and Representative Greg Vitale, both chairs of the Environmental Resources and Energy Committees in their respective chambers. That's Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.